Hey guys, so it's a new year and as usual I wanted to provide a tier list body data for this month for January. Of course we don't actually have any YCS level events for this month so far in this new format, but we did have at least 1 week worth of regional level event tops that we can go with in terms of tier score calculation, as well as like Dueling Book data from YGeoScope as always. So the score is going to be a little bit more volatile this time around, and I'll just make some commentary around some of the decks as well. And as always, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles and supplies. I'll have all the details in the description. Definitely those pre-sales for Bonfire Transaction Rollback from Maze of Millennia set have honestly been flying off the shelves, and it's really expensive. Trading Card Mint will have theirs up like early next week as well, so you can also keep an eye out for that if you're still looking for them. So we can just get started with this month's tier list body data, but I also really want to, as usual, give a big shout out to Ivan and also Ren from YGOProDeck.com. They do an incredible job keeping up with all the topping deck lists. You really should check them out. I'm going to have all the links down below. Anyways, let's just start for this month, and of course we are going to have Russ J starting off at number 1. They do have the most number of regional tops so far, and this is very early of the format. Again, about 1 week worth of data. Dueling Book wise, I've also done quite well, and I mean 63% win percentage. Usually in my like 3 years of doing this kind of stuff, you know, anytime in a like, tier 1 deck, usually in like the 60+% win range, so that's kind of typical. You know, being able to set 4 is always nice. All the you know, consistent cards in terms of the wanted engine, very expensive, but now with, you know, like it can only get better with like all the fire support that they're getting in early this year basically, so keep an eye out for this deck of course. And then Fire King is another fire deck that's going to do really well moving forward, again with, you know, bonfires coming out. You have like Populous, so it is only going to get better, but also very expensive, which is a shame because the structure deck itself, of course, you know, very cheap, and technically you can play like a budget version, but to play it optimally at a competitive level, especially like YCS level or even regional level, you know, unfortunately it's going to get quite expensive. The deck has been doing pretty solid so far, just being able to, you know, have a lot of destruction effects, right, like being able to pop. They have like a non-targeting pop, some targeting pops as well, monster negate, spell trap negate. It's got a pretty good package of interruptions and quite consistent, and will only get better as well, so definitely a deck to fear. I believe in the OCG this deck is definitely the best one out there. And then we also have Mannadium, of course, with that ban list. For some reason, they hit some of the top decks, but, you know, they did not hit Mannadium at all, especially when they hit other kind of like rogue options like Rika as well. It's kind of weird, but, you know, this deck, of course, is very scary when going first. I've been playing against a lot of these in like regional level events as well, and you know, it's very scary when you don't have Droll in hand. And even when I Droll them, I find like sometimes they just set up like a Fenrir Baron, and I mean, like honestly, against some decks like that can still be good enough. So in terms of wanted engine, I know Triff has played it with like Jet Synchron, which is like a level 1 fire, but I believe most of them don't actually play that wanted engine, which is kind of nice because, you know, that's just like another like $400 or whatever that you have to add. So this is definitely a deck that we have to watch out for, and I'm sure is the reason why Droll is still going to stick around. And then we have Labrynth. So keep in mind, of course, at this point, you know, transaction rollback is not legal right now, but of course that is the card that's coming out in this Maze of Millennia soon, next week, and it's going to make this deck really strong. It already is quite strong, right? Just very grindy. Of course, you know, it's not really like a huge trap heavy deck anymore, at least not compared to like last year when this deck first kind of emerged. Now, you know, just a lot of furnitures, they just have a lot of recursion. The one downside though is I know Ghost Bell is probably going to see an increase in play, partly due to Fire Kings as well, and you know, Ghost Bell Ash on like Welcome Big Welcome, like it is quite critical to not only prevent them from summoning out whatever they wanted to summon, but also just triggering like, you know, their lab furnitures just to get that recursion. But nonetheless, this deck is going to get quite scary very soon. And then moving on to tier 2, we do have Kashia, of course, from that ban list. They did get Unicorn back to 3. It's going to be very consistent. At least they don't have like with the whole like zone locking 5 kind of shenanigans, but you know what, still very good engine, or just as a deck in itself. It was getting some regional tops anyways, even with Unicorn at 2, and now with a 3, I'm sure there's a little bit more hype again for people who already had the deck, and just kind of actually doing pretty well regional level wise so far. And on top of that, of course, Shifter did not get banned for or hit in any fashion for some reason, so because of that, it is doing solid, and 65% win percentage online so far is actually pretty insane. Next we have Centur-Ion. This is a deck, of course, that actually has been doing well regional wise so far in this new format as well. And you know, as a deck that kind of like a side deck building set or whatever you call it, usually on the first wave they're not that good, right? Like you look at Rescue Ace, Mikanko, Pearly, even something like Rika as well. Like first wave, they're usually not that good, but Centur-Ion already is very competent deck, right? Like one card combo can play a crap ton of hand traps and like goes well with like the horror stuff as well. And so the deck can only get better moving forward. So this is definitely a really scary one. Calamity Lock is never really fun, and if they get that out, for the most part, you're probably losing. And just in terms of all the hand traps that they can play, it means that they at least have a pretty decent chance going second as well, at least for the most part. So next we have Spright, which of course did get started back to 3 recently on that list. I mean, it's not really like totally groundbreaking or anything. I mean, it's obviously a nice consistency booster, but it's not like getting like Elf back, right? So so far regional wise, this is kind of including also like Runic Spright, Runic for Hire Spright. I think from a Runic perspective, Runic for Hire Spright is probably the best one, at least over like the live twin version. Pure Spright, I mean, personally I was kind of messing around with that recently as well, just because I did play Spright when it first released, and probably like 8 months straight, so I do really like this strategy. But from a pure standpoint, I do think it's still a little bit lackluster. Like the grind game is pretty weak in that regard, so I think the Runic version is probably still the best way to go, and honestly pretty scary when it gets to go first as well. And then we have, you know, the so-called Bestial Runic, essentially the list that kind of the strategy that Joshua Schmidt won that YCS Bologna with. So from a data perspective, wide scope, it's not, there's an, obviously they can't really identify like Bestial Runic in itself. I basically kind of focus on decks that were categorized as Runic on its own, but not associated with any other archetypes. I think that's probably a decent proxy measure because this deck is quite popular right now, and it actually has been doing decently well at regional level as well. I recently did a deck profile with Luca, who won the Montreal Regional, which is really cool, and so he sent over like that deck profile video, which you can check out. And so it's certainly a very strong strategy, along with, you know, you have like Quem, which is always nice in terms of all the synchro level stuff it can do, but the Runic engine for some reason still did not get hit, so really can make that deck explode. Next, we have a pretty funny, interesting one is Orcust, of course. Harpor finally came back from that ban list, and it is at 1. I think, you know what, to be fair, regional level wise, it has done pretty decent. Of course, it's the most popular version seems to be with Horus and Bestials. There's also a Runic version, both of which you can actually check out on my channel as well. I did some recent Orcust deck profiles. So I think part of this, though, it might have to do with some initial hype with, you know, Harpor coming back. Everyone wants, like a lot of people just want to try it out again. And so there might be part of that to consider in terms of, you know, the success so far. Hopefully it actually does stay. I think it is kind of cool that Orcust is kind of come back, and it's not kind of like that like toxic tier 1 strategy anymore as it was like 2019. So let's see how this fares as we move into, you know, a month from now when we actually have some YCS events. So next we have branded Despia, which, you know, because we're only dealing with regional level data so far and no YCS events, from that perspective, I think tier 2 is fair. This deck does quite well actually at regional levels. And, you know, for example, I actually finished top 8 at a remote regional recently with branded Despia myself. I've been playing this deck for maybe like 10, 11 months straight at this point. I think it's pretty solid. Obviously it has its key flaws like Ash, but you know what, against like, let's say some of the top decks listed here in terms of, you know, Rescue Ace, Fire King, and etc., I can't really say there's any like particular matchup favoring one way or the other. I think it definitely has a lot to do with that role as well. I think it's pretty fair. I think fair matchup rather, and so I think it is a pretty solid contender right now. And of course, I don't know why, but they didn't hit branded at all either, even though they hit some of the other, you know, tier 1, tier 2 strategies. So, you know, that's kind of at least good for me, I guess, for now. Next, I'm going to throw up Pearly in here, and of course, I do think that this deck actually deserves to be higher, and, you know, at the very least, like, maybe higher than Orcust, but, you know, regional-wise, it's not that bad. I think part of it, and, you know, honestly, all 9, 60% win percentage, again, really, really strong when you can hit that mark. I think for now, it might have to just do with the fact that, you know, it did get a little bit of a hit, so maybe people just want to try something else. For now, I think it's still a very strong deck. Like, I mean, Sleepy Memory to 2 is still a notable hit, right? It's no longer a guaranteed add anymore off of my friend Pearly, but again, I think this deck, if you give it some more time, I'm sure it will climb up the ranks, but so far in the first week of regionals, not as many tops as maybe one would have thought. So next we have Telements, which technically I don't think is a rogue deck. I do think this also deserves to be in tier 2, but I mean, for now, you know, it actually had a better regional showing than Pearly so far, but at the same time, at least among all Dueling Book data, it actually saw a very drastic decline in terms of interest in play. Of course, you know, they did get Agito and Kelbeck banned, which is kind of big for the deck, but from the topping deck lists I've seen, I think they just kind of just moved on with just not playing them and not really any key changes, at least in the main deck. But for some reason, win percentage wise, at least on Dueling Book, 49% is actually rather low, but I do think this deck is, I've played against it so far post-ban list, like I think it still can be pretty formidable, especially when going first. So I don't think we can sleep on it. I think with more time and more data as we collect that, I think this will also kind of climb up the ranks as well. And then we have Vanquish Soul, which is honestly for the last little while has been like at least like the best of the rogue category and maybe worst of tier 2. It usually does sneak in at least like one YCS top here and there, like pretty relatively consistently. I think it is solid. You know, again, Shifter did not get hit. This is a deck that can main deck Shifter. There can be only one did get hit the one, but you know what? It's not like that was like a key like reliant strategy for Vanquish Soul. It was nice to have, but you know, I think they're still okay. Their core engine's still completely fine. They kind of put what it looks like an underwhelming board, but I do think that it can be pretty hard to get through to them in terms of actually pulling it out and getting the win. You know, like they can slowly chip away with like burn damage as well. So in the grind game, you probably won't have a really good chance either. And then we have Dragon Link, which is kind of weird to see them in Rogue. This is another deck, I'm sure if we give it a bit more time and, you know, more events coverage, then I'm sure it will also probably climb up as well. I mean, Bishows are pretty strong right now, especially with Labrynth about to be, like, you know, again, really strong with, like, transaction rollback and probably see a lot of play. Bishows can be very good against this strategy as well. Although, of course, again, something like Rescue Ace Fire King, like, they're not really going to do much, right? They are fire. And against Mannadium, honestly, I think if we were to at least consider from the perspective of just, like, having one Bishow in hand, I don't think it really does that much against Mannadium anyways, at least from my experience. But you can never count out on dragons. They are really strong in terms of, you know, just being able to, like, they have like a bounce, they have like some negates, they have, you know, branded beast, branded regain is like an insane grind game kind of thing as well, pop and just continuing to draw and summon. So I do think you know, you cannot count them out. Next we have Flunder, which especially at the regional level, of course, going to be very good. I actually just recently posted a deck profile with Hanko Chow, who of course pretty much tops like most regionals in this area with Flunder. So he finished top 4 at Montreal regionals this time with Flunder, so you can definitely go check out that profile as well. Win percentage wise, this deck has always done really well on Dueling Book, even like post, you know, win barrier statue ban as well. And again, of course, Shifter is kind of like the mainstay in this deck, so really strong. YCS level, as I've been mentioning the last little few months, they've really struggled in that regard, but who knows, maybe they can kind of bounce back this time around. But at least at the regional level, like really strong deck. And then we have Hero, which of course usually makes it on here just because it's a very popular deck, especially online. But you know what? You also cannot really discredit them because they also already have one regional top so far in this new format. And the last few months, actually, it has consistently gotten at least a couple regional tops, which is good to see for something that's kind of like a quote-unquote anime deck. It is actually still competitively viable. And actually in this particular format, again, something like Fire King, for example, where a lot of their cards say they have to be destroyed and also sent to the graveyard. Something like Hero and Dark Law, where just kind of macrocosmos everything, at least on the opponent side, it's actually quite strong, I would like to think. And also, of course, that's one of the reasons I recently did a profile for Virtual World as well. And you know, Shen is another kind of like one-sided walking macrocosmos, which I'm sure would also be kind of good against Fire Kings. Next we have Marincis, which is always kind of funny to see because, you know, every like 2-3 months or so it'll just get like a YCS top again. So it's a really cool strategy, Cybers. You know, it'd be kind of funny if it had some kind of strategic advantage over something like Rescue Ace or Fire Kings just because Marincis is water. But unfortunately, this is not Pokemon. But, you know, who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they do have some kind of advantage. I mean, I guess they play a lot of hand traps. You know, they also have like a kind of like an imperm from hand kind of thing. I guess that can be good against Rescue Ace. So nonetheless, if you play the deck, let me know how it fares against some of the tier 1 strategies right now. But this is another deck, you know, at least from a rogue perspective, has really consistently shown that it's able to top under the right pilot. And then next we have Chimera again. This is one of those big caveats where if we have more data, I'm sure this will climb up the ranks, especially at the very least the same level of branded Despia. So far, regional wise, there hasn't been a known regional top 8 with this deck. I'm sure there are some out there with just hasn't been collected, but you know what, so far Branded Despia definitely has a good amount of tops though. But you know, comparing to Despia, like Chimera is definitely the more like consistent strategy, but maybe not as explosive. But going first, especially now that it's kind of combined with like the horror stuff, it's really hard to go against the strategy going first, because aside from like the hand rip, but now the horror stuff also makes it really hard to like break their board, because you kind of have to commit a lot, right? Because like if you can't get rid of all the horror stuff at once, then you know they're gonna start chipping away either your board or they kind of recur resources as well. And again, shown by the win percentage here, like 59%, really strong. And I think it is still a solid choice, and I'm sure it will climb up the ranks with a bit more time and data collected. And finally, moving on to the last tier, we do have Dark World. I'm sure there's a lot of Dark World enthusiasts out there, and it did already have a regional top 8 so far, so that's good news for you guys. Although, you know, as I always say, this is probably the worst deck to play against, because it's just like a complete solitaire for like 20 minutes, and your opponent's not really doing anything. And so, 44% win percentage on Dueling Book. I was a little surprised. I kind of thought more people would just rage quit online and they would have a higher win percentage. Honestly, anytime I get paired with this deck, I know it's going to be like an hour. But nonetheless, I'm happy that this very budget deck can still get like a regional top. But of course, with like Droll and Shifter still being around, I'm sure it's not the best time for Dark World. And finally, we haven't changed. This is another deck I'm sure will at least go up the ranks with more time and data. So far, only one regional top, and it did get a notable hit in Shavara being put to 1. I think this probably has more to do with the fact that, I'm sure people just kind of want to move on and they want to try something new because of that hit. From a purely power level perspective, obviously this deck is better than some of the decks listed even in the rogue section here, right? So I think it's still a solid deck. I do think that this is another deck we have to give it some time, and I'm sure it can get more regional top as well. And who knows, maybe even a YCS level top and kind of prove people wrong. I do think that, the potential is still there. And finally, some other decks that didn't make it onto the tier list, but I did want to make a quick note about. One is Bestial Resonator. This actually got several regional top 8s so far in this new format. I think, anything with Bestial is clearly doing pretty well so far. I think from a Dueling Book perspective, there weren't any Resonators though, so didn't make it into the list. And then Mikanko actually also, it is on Dueling Book now. It can be identified by YGO now. I have spoken to the creator of it to make sure it can be identified. It also has one regional top 8 so far, which is nice to see, right? Because post the Zolde ban, it was still able to get some form of success, and I'm sure a little bit more moving forward, so that's kind of exciting to see. But I did want to make note of that, and I'm sure they'll make it onto my rogue tier list by the data, which I'll try to do next week. Alright guys, so that was it for the meta tier list by the data for this month. I'm sure we have a lot more exciting changes upcoming very soon with Maze and Millennia. We have Phantom Nightmare coming shortly around the corner next month as well. So we're really excited to see how things will change. But anyways, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. A big thanks to my patrons as always for the continued support, and well, take care guys.